Hi folks, Ara here. In today's video we're going to be discussing Demonology Warlocks specifically focused at Mythic Plus, in which we are going to talk about the 3 legendary options and my thoughts going forward as people acquire their 2 and 4 set, and talk about the pros and cons of the legendaries and how they work. So without any further delay, let's get into it. So, with the legendaries then, you have Wilfred's Sigil of Superior Summoning, which for every soul shard you spend reduces the cooldown of Summon Demonic Tyrant by 0.6 seconds. Implosive Potential, which causes your implosion to grant 1% haste for 12 seconds for each imp exploded, but when you damage at least 3 targets, you gain 5% haste per imp rather than the 1. And you then have Grim Inquisitor's Dread Calling, which for each soul shard spent on Hand of Gul'dan, it increases the damage of your next call Dreadstalkers by 4%. That buff stacks up to 30 times, but that's not in the tooltip. But it does cap out at 30. Starting with Grim Inquisitors then. This is the default legendary and by far the easiest to play around and isn't reliant on tanks. This is very much a fire and forget legendary, where the talent of choice is Soul Conduit, because you obviously want to maximize your soul shard generations, and Spenditure, so that you can buff your Dreadstalkers every 12 seconds. This particular legendary gets a lot more power once you acquire the 2 set, and is then continues to then be a powerhouse as you go through the tier. Moving on then to Implosive Potential. This is by far my favourite legendary to play around with, especially on fortified weeks, but it does have the caveat in that you have to have a very aggressive tank, and this is because you're relying on maintaining imps from pack to pack. It does also change how you play slightly, especially when it comes to your Tyrant windows, because you no longer have access to our default raid legendary that is Wilfred's, and our Tyrants are now 1.5 minutes. So it doesn't quite line up as well with Soul Rot, but at the same time, you want to have incredible amounts of haste amp so that you can have Tyrants that just turn into machine guns and will tear targets a new one. And in order to do that, the way you play with Implosive Potential is you generate your imps leading into your Tyrant. You will then cast your Tyrant as normal, so that it is buffed by the amount of imps you have. Soul Rot for the haste amp, you're playing Dreamweaver, so you're stood in the haste, and then you implode those imps on 3 or more targets. This will throw your haste to somewhere in the region of 150 to 200% haste, and if you're lucky and get a PI from a friendly priest, you could start seeing numbers that climb as high as 307%, which is my current record, and that was in a Plaguefall dungeon. This does mean that your Tyrant starts going burr, and you will hit, on average, 50-ish K on a good burst window. It does also get a lot more benefit once you get the 4 set, because you have to remember that the 4 set has a chance to spawn an extra imp, which means that at this point, rather than getting, say, 20% haste from blowing up 4 imps in a 3 target scenario, you're actually going to get 25% haste because of that extra malicious imp. This is even more the case when you start imploding 10, 12, 15 imps that you've managed to get out building up to this. Huge legendary, and is by far my favourite. So finishing off with Wilfred's then. This particular legendary prefers the use of Grimar Felguard for DPS, which does mean that it is better on tyrannical weeks, but like Implosion, it kind of leads itself to a more aggressive tank. Whereas Implosion relies on an aggressive tank because you want to be moving more and more imps from pack to pack where you can, and relies a little bit more on your positioning and your ability to keep up. The reason Wilfred wants an aggressive tank is because you want to be spending as many soul shards as you can and be fighting for as long as possible so that you actually maximize the cooldown reduction on Summon Demonic Tyrant. The problem with Wilfred's though, aside from the fact that you need to be pulling in order to maximize its benefit, is if your group is taking on a lot, which for those of you that know or don't, it is the new encrypted affix. You have 3 relics. One of them is a cooldown reduction. That cooldown reduction counteracts or impairs Wilfred's effectiveness. Now, it does help a little bit in that it speeds up the cooldown, but it kind of reduces what made Wilfred's good in the first place. which kind of is why Implosive Potential and Dreadstalkers are becoming the more favoured Mythic Plus legendaries, but Wilfred's will still have its place, especially in Tyrannical weeks, when bosses start getting to the point where you can get a third or a fourth potentially extra Tyrant in, because you're at that roughly 1 minute cooldown rather than the 1.5 minute cooldown the Tyrant is by default. So then, having discussed the legendaries and briefly touched upon how Wilfred's is affected by the encrypted affix, especially with relics being targeted so often, what are my thoughts then? Well, as people progress with the 2 set into the 4 set, I feel like we're going to be looking at a meta where it's very much going to be a mix between Grim Inquisitor's Dread Calling and Implosive Potential going forward, especially Implosive Potential on fortified weeks, when you want to be doing as much damage as you can, as often as you can, because you've got to remember that the haste amp doesn't just affect like during Tyrant windows. The more haste you have, the more damage all your pets do, and if your Dreadstalkers and your Imps are just attacking faster consistently, then you're going to do a lot more damage. Like, I'm averaging 15, 16-ish K in places from pack to pack, and my end of dungeon stuff at 270 item level with 2-piece, I am finishing most dungeons between 13 and 15k depending on the dungeon and how trash heavy it is. Able to keep up with people with 4 set, so not doing too bad. I do feel like Wilfred's is still going to have its place for a while during Tyrannical weeks, however, and you might want to discuss with your group about whether or not Vi is the preference or If you are looking at though, I'd probably go Grim Inquisitors on the Tyrannical weeks, purely because then you're getting the Dreadstalker usage. But there's a case for all 3 legendaries to be made, and I personally will be playing a lot with Implosive Potential and experimenting a little bit more with Dread Calling next week. Hope you've liked the video, and I will catch you all in the next one. Take it easy, folks.